Diva Cordigaler, my name is James Nagle, welcome to The Irish Nation Lives. By 1919, the Royal Irish Constabulary was a shell of its former self. In the decades of relative peace following the land wars, British authorities in Ireland had become complacent and had allowed the RIC to deteriorate. Pay was low and pensions hadn't been increased for years, affecting morale and the attractiveness of a career in the force. The average constable had 15 years of service and was 35 years of age, which would have made them too old for first-line military service. Though armed with revolvers and obsolete carbines, the prevailing conditions meant that these were now mostly for show. Many didn't even bother to load their weapons and had little practice with them. The RIC was totally unprepared for the IRA offensive, which began in 1919. In the first year following the Solohead Beg ambush, just 99 men resigned from the police in Ireland. Attacks against the RIC were infrequent, and those that did occur were generally aimed at seizing weapons. Many older members of the force were a few years out from a pension or increased benefits. These kept their heads down and were said to be playing for safety. However, while few left the RIC in the first year of the War of Independence, even fewer joined. In April, Dáil Éireann ordered that the force be boycotted, when Eamon de Valera proposed that members of the police forces acting in this country as part of the forces of the British occupation and as agents of the British government be ostracised socially by the people of Ireland. To shun them, to refuse to talk or have any social intercourse with them or treat them as equals, will give them vividly to understand how utterly the people of Ireland loathe both themselves and their calling. Throughout 1919, 500 men left the force when resignations, retirements and discharges were taken into account, but only 400 enlisted to replace them. Westminster was adamant that disturbances in Ireland were caused by a criminal minority who would be handled by the police, but as attacks increased, it was clear that the RIC had neither the training, the age profile, nor the manpower to take on the IRA. In November, hundreds of barracks across the country were ordered to close to reinforce the remainder up to a minimum of 6 men, and in February of 1920 even more were abandoned, leaving large stretches of the country without any RIC presence. As early as May of 1919, the First Lord of the Admiralty, Walter Long, had suggested that the RIC should be reinforced by British ex-servicemen. Following the end of the World War, tens of thousands found themselves unemployed, including 52,000 in London alone. The idea found favour with the Lord Lieutenant, Sir John French, but was opposed by the RIC Inspector General Joseph Byrne, who felt that ex-soldiers couldn't be controlled under police discipline. To Long and French, this was an indication that Byrne had lost his nerve. In December, he was forced to take a month's leave and was replaced by T.J. Smith from Belfast in his absence. He was ignored on his return and resigned as Inspector General in March of 1920. With a more favourable man now in charge, recruiting of ex-servicemen could begin. On the 27th of December, Smith issued an order authorising recruitment centres to be established in Britain, and on the 2nd of January 1920, William Byrd, who had served with the Royal Navy during the war, joined in London. Days later, newspapers reported that on the 7th of January, there travelled to Dublin a party of 15 English recruits for the Royal Irish Constabulary. From here, these men went to the RIC training depot at the Phoenix Park, where the regular 6-month course was condensed to just 6 weeks, after which the first recruits were deployed to barracks across the country. On the 28th of February, the Meath Chronicle reported that some 8 or 10 members of the Royal English Constabulary marched to Navan on Tuesday. They were in a sort of hybrid uniform, blue overcoats with khaki trousers peeping out beneath. The same day, under the headline Khaki Policemen, the Connacht Tribune wrote that English ex-soldier RIC recruits were seen for the first time in Galway. The new police were in khaki uniform, but wore the policemen's long black coats and black caps. In March, some 30 Englishmen in khaki uniform arrived in Tipperary to strengthen the local constabulary force. This odd mixture of clothing was due to a shortage in RIC uniforms caused by the Dáil boycott. Tailors refused to make new ones, and those that were available weren't always fit for purpose. The RIC had a minimum height requirement of 5'9", but this was dropped for British recruits, the vast majority of whom were under this standard. In March, Christopher O'Sullivan, editor of the Limerick Echo, described meeting A strange type of individual wearing the black cap and tunic of the Royal Irish Constabulary and khaki trousers of the British soldier. The uniform looked 2 sizes too big for its wearer. Measuring a mere 5'7" tall and around the 10-stone mark, this puny creature resembled something one would associate with the Scarteen hunt. This was a reference to a famous pack of hunting dogs, better known by their nickname, the Black and Tans. By July, this name would be in widespread use throughout the country to describe these oddly attired reinforcements, and was even used by British officials. Initially, recruits were hard to come by. From January to June of 1920, just 100 men enlisted each month. In July, RIC pay was doubled, which led to a small increase, but it wasn't until October that authorities started to get the numbers they were looking for. The sack of Balbriggan by the Black and Tans on the 20th of September was so widely reported in Britain that it may have been the first time that many ex-servicemen heard that there were jobs going in Ireland. The following month, well over 1,000 men enlisted. By this stage, recruiting for a new force had begun, the Auxiliary Division of the Royal Irish Constabulary. Open to commissioned officers demobilised from the war, the auxiliaries were split into companies and envisaged as a mobilised strike force. Other than the tam o' shanter or Balmoral cap, the auxiliaries were allowed to wear any police or military uniform they wanted, and this often led to them being mistaken for the Black and Tans. By the summer of 1920, the rule of law had ceased to function in Ireland. Tax offices and abandoned RIC barracks were burned across the country in early April, and in the first 6 months of the year, 40 members of the police force had been killed by the IRA. In June, the Chief Secretary, Sir Hammer Greenwood, informed the Cabinet that throughout the greater part of Ireland, criminal justice can no longer be administered by the ordinary constitutional process of trial by judge and jury. Cases of violence against the RIC collapsed due to the non-attendance of jurors, and when they did attend, they refused to convict in even clear-cut cases. RIC members and their families were shunned by the local community, and the law was powerless to do anything against those who attacked them. Now, resignation started to mount, but many of those who didn't leave or play for safety became increasingly bitter and violent. In January, the RIC had carried out their first reprisal following the killing of a constable in Thurles, and in the face of a perceived reluctance to act by the British government, they continued to take matters into their own hands. Into this atmosphere, the Black and Tans arrived, and taking their lead from their Irish peers, they would engage in acts of wanton cruelty against the Irish people and captured rebels. Republican propaganda during and after the War of Independence depicted the Black and Tans as prone to violence and crime. In 1926, Piers Beasley wrote that the Black and Tans were largely drawn from the criminal classes, and authentic cases were discovered where they had been released by a beneficent government from penal servitude, incurred through revolting crimes to enable them to bring the lights of English law and order to Ireland. While this is still often believed today, the truth is that those who wanted to join the RIC had to show that they were of good character, which ruled out ex-convicts, and with over 150,000 unemployed ex-servicemen, there was no need to scour Britain's jails for recruits. Obviously then, these were deranged and broken men, their minds shattered by what they had witnessed in the trenches of the First World War. Suffering from what is now known as post-traumatic stress disorder, they were described by Dorothy McArdle as men of low mentality whose more primitive instincts had been aroused by the war and who were now difficult to control. In Britain, these men were mentally and medically unfit to remain in civilised society, but in Ireland they could be police officers. Again, this is an outdated attempt to rationalise the depravity that these men would unleash in Ireland. The reality is that they were ordinary men, totally unprepared for the guerrilla war they found themselves in. In the trenches, they had fought against a uniformed enemy, and following brief periods of danger at the front line, they were rotated out to the relative safety of the reserve trenches to rest. In Ireland, though, they found themselves in a siege situation, surrounded by a hostile population and barricaded into barracks with a native police force that had lost faith in its government and the local community it was sworn to protect. On patrol, each turn in the road could be hiding an ambush party, and even the most well-defended barracks wasn't safe. In July, the first black and tan to be killed in Ireland died in County Kerry when a landmine was dropped in behind the metal shutters of the barrack window. Fighting a shadow army that struck from cover and retreated into the mountains, they turned to reprisals against the local population in attempts to deter them from supporting the IRA. The destruction of property, burning of businesses and homes, and murder brought no consequences, and in some cases they even received the tacit support of their superiors. Indiscipline and alcoholism would become rife, and while they were sent to Ireland to restore law and order, their name would come to be known across the world as a byword for lawlessness and brutality. The stories of their actions would come to dominate the post-war of independence narrative, and many of the Irish who fought in the conflict refer to it simply as the Tan War. In 1941, when the government created a medal for those who had served in the Irish Republican Army during the War of Independence, it was issued with a black and tan ribbon. If you've enjoyed this episode, please give it a like and subscribe to be kept up to date with new episodes on the events of 100 years ago during the Irish War of Independence. Accordia, thank you for joining me on The Irish Nation Lives. Slán go fóill.